Good morning, Ecumenical Advocacy Days. I am Reverend Michael Newroth, the Acting Director of the United Church of Christ office here in Washington, D.C., and part of the planning team for this year's Ecumenical Advocacy Days. Years ago, I also coordinated this conference, so it is really special to me, and I'm really excited this morning to moderate this workshop with my two great colleagues here. This workshop is, as you know, going to be covering the People Over Pentagon bill, H.R. 1134, as well as the principles of that bill, which are part of our EAD lobby ask this year. So hopefully many of you are here to learn a little bit more about that ask, and maybe ask some questions about it from our two experts this morning. I'm really excited personally that EAD is taking this effort up because while the faith community, I think we have often talked about the budget being a moral document. So often we've been somewhat tentative to speaking out directly on issues of military spending. I think this is in part because we have often felt that we've lacked the expertise to speak into issues of global threats and military preparedness, etc., as well as the fear of turning our backs on military families and our congregations. But we know as people of faith that this is fundamentally faulty logic, that our faith is holistic and demands that we apply it to all aspects of life, and therefore all aspects of our budget in our nation. And if we look at the federal budget today, we see that remains disproportionately lopsided toward Pentagon spending, that more than half of our discretionary spending goes toward the Pentagon this year. As you'll hear, the president's budget already asked for $880 billion toward the Pentagon, and with the help of the hawks in Congress, may eclipse $1 trillion either this year or probably by next year. And that spending here in the U.S. is also spurring a global military spending boom that has eclipsed $2.2 trillion last year. And all this while people around the world and here in our own nation are starving. And so it's time that we put the people over the Pentagon. And to help us think more about how to do that, we have two experts here with us. We have Elizabeth Beavers, who's the Peace and Security Advocacy Consultant. She's an independent strategist for peace and security advocacy after previously holding roles advocating for demilitarizing U.S. foreign policy at Indivisible, Amnesty International, and the Friends Committee on National Legislation. And you may recognize Elizabeth from our Ask Plenary, because she's already been with us once and did a great job. And joining her this morning is Savannah Wooten, who is the People Over Pentagon advocate at Public Citizen. Public Citizen is one of the organizations that is really pushing the campaign side of the People Over Pentagon campaign. And she organizes that coalition to reduce military spending and reinvest in domestic and human needs priorities. So welcome to both of you. Welcome to all of you who are tuning in this morning. Elizabeth, I'll turn to you first. Can you give us a little bit more? I know you've talked a little bit about the People Over Pentagon bill, but I want to start with you to get your comments.
For sure. Thank you so much to Reverend Noroth and to everyone who's here for EAD. It's really exciting to be with you. Thank you so much for including us in this. It's really awesome what you all are doing. So thanks to everyone who joined us yesterday for the plenary. We'll try not to repeat too much information, but I thought I'd give you a little bit more background on the campaign itself, the People Over Pentagon campaign. So as Reverend Noroth mentioned, I am advising Public Citizen, which is, if you're not familiar, is an incredible organization that has been fighting corporate power and corruption for decades. And they have really kind of set their sights on just how much corporate greed and profiteering and harm is being perpetuated through the military industrial complex and what it has done to our federal budget as a result. So I wanted to give you a little bit more background into this campaign. So, for so long in this country, I'm sure you all have remembered the days since the Obama administration when there was the sequestration deal and the Budget Control Act, and we had this whole deal to avert the fiscal apocalypse, which it's very sad that we're repeating all that right now. But this big deal that Democrats and Republicans struck where Pentagon spending and non-military spending had to stay at pace and achieve parity, parity, and that one isn't supposed to increase without the other. Of course, that's not really ever how it happened. There was for a long time this slush fund, the overseas contingencies operation that Pentagon spending was able to balloon and balloon and balloon. And on the non-military spending side, domestic human needs just keeps getting underfunded. But we keep getting sold this lie about like, oh, we want to keep them at parity, want to keep them at level. So we don't live under that world anymore. That budget deal has expired. The federal budget now doesn't have those sort of constraints such that they were ever constraints in the first place. And so a few years ago, it was in 2019 when Public Citizen was really noticing, like we're at kind of a moment where, particularly for those who hold themselves out to be fairly progressive, across many different sectors, the way that our budget aligns itself, the way that those levels shake out, it kind of affects us all. And it's time to stop being timid, as Reverend Norrell said, is a great word, timid, about taking on the military budget and acknowledging how much it has ballooned and how much we are sold this lie that we've got to keep these levels at parity. We've got to keep them even when they have never been even. It is always the case that the Pentagon budget goes up and up and up and up, and we're left constantly being asked, oh, healthcare, but how will we pay for it? Funding for human needs priorities, housing, anti-poverty initiatives, hunger, climate initiatives. How? Okay, sure, but how are you going to pay for it? We never get asked that question on the military spending side. So Public Citizen has been organizing an incredible campaign, and thank you so much to Dan for dropping in the chat. You can check out the website here. Pulling together organizations from many different sectors: climate justice, racial justice, immigrant justice, anti-poverty initiatives, faith, peace, security, many different organizations calling for big cuts in the Pentagon budget. It's time to stop kind of nibbling around the edges. We want to take a big bite out of it. We want to ask for what we really want, which is to see a huge cut on the military side, and not just a cut, but we want that to be reinvested in human needs. And so the People Over Pentagon campaign started out by urging, this was in 2019, so the presidential election at the time was in full swing, calling on candidates, tell us, how much would you cut from the military budget? How much would you reallocate away from weapons of war and destruction towards human needs? All these plans that you're telling us as candidates, and you're talking about how you would pay for it. What about taking a chunk out of the Pentagon budget to pay for it? So we were able to get a few presidential candidates on the record, which sometimes that's a good way to get a national conversation started. And some specific plans came out about cuts and reallocations. And that's how we move change forward, right? As we make it normal to talk about these things and to debate them and to put ideas out there. So since then, we've actually seen Congress step up in a way they haven't in a really long time. Back in, let's see, it would have been 2020. Yeah. For the first time, we had our champions, Congresswoman Barbara Lee, who we all love, Congressman Mark Pocan. And then over on the Senate side, Senator Sanders introduced, they introduced similar initiatives as part of the amendment process in the National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA, calling at the time for a 10% cut in the Pentagon budget, exempting troop pay and healthcare, but cutting 10% from everything else. And it actually did pretty well. I mean, really like shockingly well. Of course, we haven't yet built up enough power where we're ready to win this. But at the time, we got 90 some members of the House on the record in favor and 23 senators. That's pretty amazing, in favor of a huge chunk, a huge cut to the Pentagon budget, something, you know, for years we've been afraid to really talk about and put on the floor for a vote. So in the succeeding years, the People Over Pentagon campaign has continued building power, getting endorsements on these proposals from outside groups. Many, I think, are here organizing EAD, getting more members of Congress to co-sponsor and to be on the record saying, yes, I actually am pushing back against the status quo. I actually am totally comfortable calling for a big cut and reallocations of the Pentagon budget. And so this news is there's news coming out earlier this week that makes this incredibly timely, which is that the big report that comes out every year about global military spending came out, and it shows that the United States right now is spending more money on the military than the next 10 countries combined. I think you would just be shocked to know that if you listen to Congress, because we're constantly told how we've got to keep spending because China's catching up. We got to keep spending because Russia's catching up. We got to, not even close. We're spending about 10 times more than Russia is, something almost 3 times more than China is. It's just not based in reality. I mean, that's a really overwhelming number. The Pentagon budget takes up more than half of our discretionary federal budget, and about half of that goes directly into the pockets of big military contractors. So these are just facts. This is not Elizabeth's opinion. Well, I can tell you Elizabeth's opinion. I have all kinds of them, but these are just facts. These are documented facts that we need to get out there, and we need to ask members of Congress to take some responsibility for helping to create this problem, but now give them the opportunity to be a part of the solution. It really is a disturbing dynamic, as Reverend Neuroth mentioned. Every year for the past few years, the president requests a huge increase in the Pentagon budget. And then Congress, it's so funny, right? We hear about Congress and the president fighting over the budget, and the president asks for all this money and Congress just gives a little bit. Doesn't work that way on the Pentagon budget. Democrat, Republican, doesn't matter what party. Congress says, sure thing, no problem. Actually, would you like some more? How about dozens more billions of dollars than you even asked for? So that's exactly what happened last year. It's exactly what happened the year before. It's exactly what happened the year before that. So it's probably what's going to happen again this year. President Biden has just requested $886 billion for the military. And Congress has already said, reporting just came out yesterday where members of Congress are saying, we don't know yet what our number is going to be, but it's going to be more than that. So we are getting really close to $1 trillion Pentagon budget. To me, it already is so incomprehensible to talk about all these billions of dollars. $1 trillion every single year for the military is just unfathomable. So that's why we're running this campaign. We are trying to build power, trying to build support. We're envisioning a different world. We're saying it doesn't actually have to be this way. Think of what we could have, just a rounding error in the Pentagon's budget. Think of what this country could look like. I love how EAD is set up, the swords and plowshares kind of dynamic. What if we refashion just a few of our swords into plowshares? What kind of changes to everyday people's lives could we see? So you can check out at peopleoverpentagon.org. You can see a bit about the organization fold. You can see about some of our initiatives, some of the letters we've sent, some of the resolutions we've signed on to, some of just all the different work that people are doing. We're so happy you all are helping us get involved here, or that you all are getting involved in this ask and in this campaign. It really is just so urgent. I feel as a matter of policy, as a matter of morality, we are in a truly, truly urgent moment. And it's actually pretty shocking that not that many people are talking about this. It really is an increasingly bold thing to just say that it's not okay and that it's totally fine. We're not going to, we hear all kinds of scaremongering about the security and this and that. And something that's particularly compelling to me is, we're talking about service members and their families and making sure they're taken care of. That's deeply, deeply important to me, to public citizen, to others. And it's a shame because that's not what's happening right now with that big budget. As we said, about half of it goes directly into expensive contractors, lines the pockets of CEOs, helps to do stock buybacks and increasing corporate profits. And service members are food insecure, are facing poverty at record levels. So, we're all for helping to make sure that those who put their lives on the line because their country asked them to are taken care of in return. That absolutely should happen. It's not what's happening with this budget now. We'd love to see it happen. When we say people over Pentagon, we mean people who are in the military. We mean people who are not in the military. A people-centered budget does not look like what we have now. So I'm going to pause there because my intent here was just to kind of give you more of the context about this campaign and let you know a little bit of the context for this ask that you all are pursuing, that you all are going to members of Congress and urging them to join this effort, to speak out, to join the resolution if they're on the House side. But I will let Savannah speak a bit more about the ask itself, about the bill, and what you all need to know as you talk to Congress. So thanks so much for having us, and I'll look forward to your questions as well.
Great. Thank you, Elizabeth. One quick thing to add before Savannah speaks. I was struck last night. We heard a presentation of Swords into Plowshares Northeast, which actually is an organization that does gun buybacks and beats the guns into farm tools. That's actually what the projects that they do. And I was thinking about that in the context of really, how do we do that not just on the individual level of actually beating these guns, but how do we beat the Pentagon budget in a really tangible way into something that cultivates life? And that is part of what we're doing. So thank you, Elizabeth, for that. And Savannah.
Great. Thank you. Also, that project sounds so interesting. That will be my homework for after the session, is to go look that up. I do love any instance where some of the things that we're doing more rhetorically are taken literally. So that's a fascinating one. Thank you so much. And I am only going to take, 5 to 10 minutes to kind of give us the nitty gritty about the specific bill and ask that those of you who are participating in the EAD lobby day sessions may be going in and lobbying on. So not only do we have this broad overview from Elizabeth about our campaign in the last few years, we also, one of the biggest achievements of the last 4 years of our campaign and then the last 2 is that we now have a standalone bill to be pushing on this on in the very literal way that we were just talking about. So I'm going to thank Dan for sending the broader People Over Pentagon page, and I'm also going to send the specific landing page for the bill itself, where we have a lot of organizing information about it, and just talk a little bit about People Over Pentagon Act. So this bill, this is the second time it's been introduced. It was reintroduced earlier this year in February, but prior to that was introduced last year, is a bill that we worked closely with Representatives Lee and Pocan, like Elizabeth mentioned, those who were the champions on the House side, working on first NDAA amendments, so kind of like piloting this idea of cutting, 10% of the budget, then thinking about what the new fights on this front essentially were going to look like. We've been through a wildly busy few years where there have been, so many different angles to approach this Pentagon spending conversation from, obviously 2020, the year that we first started talking about this and doing our NDAA cuts. That was when we were going headfirst into the COVID pandemic, and people started talking, very viscerally about, how is it that we are supposed to have the most fortified national defense in the world. We are, pouring this amount of money into it, and still, we have people wearing trash bags and not having an adequate PPE. We had this very visible flex of military might with like the Thunderbirds flying over cities that were in crisis. And then, we absolutely didn't have the things that people needed just to survive the early days of the pandemic. And so there was, we were talking about it from that angle. We were talking about it in light of a lot of the emergent conversation around climate justice and the need for really investing in things that will make us truly secure. And a lot of those are not just, inflating, our weapons line items infinitely. It's investing in more true security. So throughout the, years that we were beginning to talk about what does true security look like, it doesn't look like what we're doing now, which is just infinitely plussing up this Pentagon budget. How can we reallocate funding? That was where a lot of this campaign coalesced, and then Congress followed suit very quickly after in putting together some of these proposals. So the People Over Pentagon Act was a really hard-earned introduction piece of standalone legislation we just got last year. It was introduced for the very first time last summer, and what it does is it is a really overarching like top line messaging bill, but it would cut $100 billion. So thinking, if you have the number that Elizabeth just gave you of 880 something billion, which is proposed for this coming year, but it would cut $100 billion of that. and has a note kind of in the bill text that there is a real sense that funding could be used elsewhere, that there is excess waste, fraud, abuse within the Pentagon budget, and we should be reclaiming that funding to invest in things that are more true national security and human needs priorities. Notably, the bill does not reallocate funding directly. So were it to be passed, it would just cut the top line, and then it really leaves it open. We did that by design, essentially, in putting this together with the offices. Essentially, that allows groups like yourself and any advocate that is invested in reallocating that funding into other human needs priorities to say where you'd like that money to go. So essentially, it would be, were it passed, up to DoD to reflect the where that funding is getting cut from, and groups are able to say, okay, what could we do with $100 billion reallocated elsewhere? And if you look, I'm sure many of the groups on this call have done a lot of the very literal trade-offs of like where that funding could go. It's $100 billion could go a long way towards people's needs. If you look at the actual, comparisons of things, if you open the landing page for the bill, you'll see some of the trade-offs. We've worked with a partner organization, the National Priorities Project, who's incredible. And they actually, when this bill first came out, did some literal trade-offs of like $100 billion. And they determined that, last year when this came out and they did some of the number crunching, $100 billion could have powered every household in the United States with solar energy. You could hire 1 million elementary school teachers amidst a worsening teacher shortage, or you could provide free tuition for 2 out of 3 public college students in the US. So when you are actually thinking about some of those trade-offs, I think, like Elizabeth said, you can be like, billion with a B, that is like very hard for my brain to grasp. I think the zeros at the end of these numbers really just kind of like we lose our ability to conceptualize what that money could do. But when you start looking at what could other, federal, if we really directly translated this federal funding, what could we be investing in? It's quite powerful investments in people. So anyways, the bill itself doesn't choose one of those options, but rather we've done some of the comparisons so that we can start messaging on it in that way. But it is just making a broad statement that 100 billion or more, but in this case, we're organizing around 100 billion. It's a very flat, easy number to be talking about. It is sizable. It is, there have been many reports saying that amount is, can be easily found for cuts without sacrificing national security in any way. And so it basically lays out the case that we should start there. So the bill right now, in terms of the state of play, we were really excited to hear that the champions were ready and on it this Congress, ready to reintroduce it and like hit the ground running in terms of organizing for co-sponsors. We're up to 15 co-sponsors right now and are kind of working to add them incrementally. So the meetings that you're going to be doing are really valuable. I think if you're able to speak both to the fact that you'd love to see your representative support this bill and then also be vocal on where they would like to see funding reallocated, things that they would like to see funded, and even resistant to the idea that Congress is poised on the brink of adding even more to 886 billion. Being able to speak up at this phase in the committee process, they co-sponsor this bill, and also we do not need to keep ballooning this budget in this way is really powerful. One thing that is helpful, I think we'll see if there are Q&As in the chat about the bill or how we formulated it in the way that we did, but we do often get the question, where does 100 billion come from? So I can answer that. And then also what about, like you had kind of queued us up in the beginning of the conversation, what about service members, or will this impact their pay or their programming? So the answers to those in sequence are 100 billion is, for many purposes, a like flat organizing number, right? There are many cases that could be made that you could cut up to 200 billion, 350 billion. Yes, I'll send the co-sponsors in the chat shortly. But there have been so many different reports identifying different programs that are wasteful. The Pentagon has never has never passed an audit, rather. They failed the last 5 audits they've undergone. And so we just have ample examples of where this funding could come from. 100 billion was selected, both because it is a number that we know can easily be found in waste and abuse. And then secondarily, we're able to point to, for those who need a little bit more backing than that, a CBO report that was requested by Senator Sanders in 2021, where he said essentially, can you model out some examples of cutting the Pentagon budget and showing, ways that you could do this, without significant harm to our strategy as a military. And this report came out saying that, if you were able, it basically showed how you could cut $1 trillion over 10 years, which broken down is $1 billion off the annual budget over 10 years. And so using that was also an easy place. And so if you look up the bill text on congress.gov, you'll see that there's a nod to that CPO report, and we're happy to send it along here as well. But that, if you do get asked, why $100 billion, isn't that a little bit of a random number? It's a flat organizing number that we know you could easily, cut off the Pentagon and recoup in known waste and fraud and programs that are redundant, contractor profits. And also, here's an example of how you could do that without, harming anything that you're sounding the alarm bells about harming. Then secondarily to the question about service members, the bill, our champions have been very thoughtful about that. They are as supportive of service members as any other member, and really do a lot for the service members in their districts. They have designed it such that it will be a top line cut were it to be passed, but it would exempt service member pay and the Defense Health Agency. And so often there are people saying, well, there are these pockets of the military budget that we can't cut or can't afford to, do a sweeping cut over because they will support, people. And our response to that is absolutely, that's why they're carved out. This would be a top line reduction to everything that's not those programs. And so that is a handy thing to have in your pocket when you go into meetings, because you may be asked that. And the answer is that has already been designed into the bill text. So I see that there are some questions in the chat, and I want to make sure that we have time for those. So I will wrap us up in just a second, but we'll just say that our big push for this year as a coalition, one, we'd love for your organization not only to join us, for the lobby days that you're going into right now, or the meetings that you're having now, but also to fold into the campaign more broadly. We are continuing to organize. We're both reaching out to a lot of different members. We've got a specific target list of people that we think are maybe more likely to get on, and we'd love to work with you on kind of doing that specific office to office advocacy. And we're really just pushing to grow this list of members who are unafraid to speak up on this issue to higher and higher heights, because I think it is an issue, like Elizabeth had mentioned, like we've been leading with, throughout the entirety of this conference. It is an issue that people are more skittish around, and it's so outlandish. And we've seen that there's really a role for civil society, for faith groups, to be bolstering any champions that we have and making it more palatable to speak up on this. It seems like the kind of thing where the president's budget would come out, or a top up to the budget would, be announced, or something like the debt deal that's happening right now would happen, and you would just have people screaming from the rooftops that the way that we spend on the Pentagon is really, disproportionate. And there would be an immediate activated response. And what I will say is that we have become the immediate activated response, but it's really the groups and people over Pentagon and the groups in this room that are doing a lot of that work. It is a place where a little goes a long way, and our voices are really valuable. And were we not saying anything, we really wouldn't have that robust of a response. And so it's one of the places where we're really on the front lines, quite literally, of raising the alarm about how intense we've been spending on the military. And that's all to say, this outreach that you're doing is really laying the foundation for this conversation in future years, right? I would say, and Elizabeth can attest to this, even a few years ago, we were we were intentionally organizing around the presidential campaigns because we were Congress is really protracted on this. We are having a tough time organizing there. Maybe if we work and kind of engage the presidential candidates, we can generate some momentum and go back. And that is indeed what happened. But the testament to the fact that it was such a tough situation where Democrats and Republicans alike were really not great on this issue. And so by generating some outside power, we then came back and were able to do this 10% cut amendment. Similarly, as the 10% cut amendment, gained some strength and was kind of talked about the following year of oh yeah, are we going to see another 10% cut amendment? And even that, a year or two prior would have been unheard of, but they were yeah, the people who are supporting cuts to the Pentagon budget, what are they going to be doing this year? So creating this sense of an organized resistance to this. And then it kind of as follows, we've had a lot of success with then, the members themselves started saying, oh, we could get a standalone bill. I think we've gained this issue, this issue has built enough strength that we're ready to then organize on it as its own entity. So I think it's a testament that the fact that we even have this bill is a testament to the fact that we've been building power over these last few years. And it is an exciting area to be like on the precipice of working on it. And so really the biggest thing that we can all do as a coalition right now is like get as many members as possible on this bill, be vocal about our support for it. And at every phase in the process, the budget process this year, be talking about the fact that this is so misaligned, essentially. So we're so excited to have you all folded into it. It's exciting, although I know it can be like a somber topic when you really look at the comparisons, right? That's all the more energizing for why we need to be doing this work. So appreciative of that. And I'll hand it back over. I know that you all may have questions about the bill itself.
Thank you, Savannah, and to both of you for laying out this, the challenge before us. I think this, as you both have said, like we are challenging some, fundamental views here in our country, and especially views that are rather cemented here on the Hill, and touching the nerves of on issues that a lot of members of Congress would prefer not to talk about, and that's our call. We are called to lift this up. And so I'm wondering, we had a question here from Winnie. Is there anything that's unrelated to defense that's been added to the bill that prevents GOP reps from supporting it? So I want to pose that, and I don't think there is, but I want to ask the question in the context of not only kind of why Republicans may not support this, but also more so in the question of a lot of our visits today are going to be obviously on the Senate side. We have a few House visits, but are going to be a lot of allies or at least, Democrats who are with us and, similar views on many issues, but on this are not, or it's a much tougher case to be made with them. And I'm thinking there's a group that's visiting Senator Gillibrand today, and they reached out to say, how do we, she's both on the Armed Services Committee and on the Ag Committee. And so she's with us on the Plowshares Ask on the Ag Committee of SNAP. She's recently introduced a bill strengthening SNAP. But I imagine on the Armed Service, given her role in the Armed Services, she's going to bring up, her staffers likely going to push back on this issue. And so I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about how you might message differently depending on the offices that people are entering in, and this particularly around like how do we talk about it with offices that we support on so many other issues, but on this issue we view differently.
I can start us off there. Can you all hear me? My internet's being a little jumpy. All good? Okay. It might just be on my end. You can wave if I disappear or whatever. Yeah. Oh, wait.
No, I was just waving.
Oh, okay. Just acknowledging. Okay. Okay, great. Yeah, there's literally no reason Republicans can't support. In fact, the text was specifically designed to help conservative groups on the outside endorse the bill, which they have. So something that's interesting is, the bill doesn't say where the $100 billion should be reallocated to, just that it should be. And some conservative groups message around that by saying, well, it should be reallocated to pay down our national deficit and debt. That's not my view. But hey, that's one of the great things about a messaging bill is you can message on it whatever rings the most true for you. So to me, I think that speaking to different offices, something that Dan said in the chat, I believe, is that like, why do we treat the Pentagon budget different than every single other part of our budget? That's really the main thing, especially in this key moment when we've got, particularly on the Republican side, there's a lot of hand wringing about like high spending generally and the need to cut. And then there's this new deal they just passed yesterday about how they're just going to cut all these parts of the budget, but not the Pentagon budget. Definitely not the Pentagon budget. Let's exempt that one. So to me, I think that's the message is why. Why is that exempt? Why is that the one part of the budget where there's a magic money machine and everything else is the one where we've got to like track down every last cent? I think it's really holding feet to the fire on being consistent and having some integrity across your entire ideology. If you think that money is scarce when it comes to feeding hungry people, why don't you think it's scarce when it comes to pouring more money into the military industrial complex? I think that's for all offices. And for those meeting with Senator Gillibrand, that's awesome. She's a super interesting case because she has been supportive in the past of, I believe she voted for the 10% cut back in 2020. But in the last couple of years on the Armed Services Committee, she has supported the increased military budget above what the president has even asked for. So there's a lot of questions to ask her there. And I think, looking for her to join her colleague, Senator Warren, on the committee and pushing back against those increases is a great thing to ask her to do. And even just speaking out and noting with alarm that we are getting close to $1 trillion Pentagon budget, that should be something we can, at a minimum, expect them to do.
Yeah, thanks for that. Kind of a related question that came up from Carol. She was asking the question that you made in the, I think, opening plenary around how spending on Pentagon spending and spending in the military is a poor job creator compared to investment in other sectors. And so I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about that. I know there was a report that came out years ago on that, but also wondering, is that a talking point, for offices that may be, more interested in the job creation side of this? How would you frame kind of that messaging to those offices?
Yeah, totally. It's a great question. I did mention it yesterday and I did not today. Thank you for that, Carol. I'm just putting it in the chat so everyone can see it. But another organization that I get to work with in my capacity as a consultant is the Cost of War Project at Brown University. And they produced a study that demonstrated how, as we were talking about yesterday, the military and the military industrial complex is a jobs program in this country. It's really the only true federally supported jobs program we have. And that is by design. That is totally intentional. Defense contractors have made sure to sort of like get their hooks in the U.S. economy in a way that makes people feel like they are just, it's inevitable. We have to do this. What about jobs? And so this report I'm putting in the chat here, let's see if this works. Great. Demonstrates how, like, dollar for dollar, spending the exact same amount of money on other sectors like healthcare or education would create way more jobs, and that military spending is one of the worst ways to create jobs, but we keep doing it anyway. So it kind of just doesn't have to be this way. We have chosen to create an economy that is dependent on being in a constant state of like fear and war. But again, that is by design, and that design is bad, and we can change it. And in fact, it is better for working people if we did change it and if we transitioned away. So this paper is really incredible. That chart is really amazing. A great thing to point out to offices. We can create way more jobs by investing in other sectors. We just have to invest in those sectors, though.
Yeah. And there's a follow-up question that I think relates to this from Winnie. This is, do we have access to information on legislators' personal financial gain tied to defense spending? I bet there's a big connection. And I would add, one of the ways in which we quoted President Eisenhower in the opening session about the military industrial congressional complex. Bishop Wester added the congressional complex to that. We know that military contractors have done a great job of getting pieces of military equipment, factories and other things, dispersed across the country in different districts as a way to create jobs and other factors, and put pressure on members of Congress to kind of keep their foot on the pedal of spending more money on Pentagon. I wonder if you could speak either to the personal financial gain, but more so kind of that pushing back against that dynamic, because we hear a ton about that, the ways in which the economic challenge of cutting the Pentagon. But the reality is, there's a ton of other sectors of industries and schools and other things that are job creators in those same districts. And we're failing to see the connection between that. So I wonder if either of you might comment along those lines.
I can jump in for a second, and then Elizabeth, if you have more to add. I mean, it's a really good point, and I'm glad that someone asked it. Also, I will say to the dollar for dollar point that Elizabeth was just making and referencing the Cost of War project, I would say when we have lobby meetings, that is actually one of the things that people don't know or are the most surprised by. I think some of the things that we talk about, of course, like there are redundant weapon systems and there is waste, and the Pentagon has consistently failed its audits. Those are things that tend to be like more recognized talking points on the Hill, and people will nod along with us. But then in learning about the fact that it is such a poor job creator and that transitioning to other sectors would actually be, more valuable and more job creating, that is one that we tend to get people being like, oh, interesting. Can you send us that report? So that is helpful for your meetings as well. And just following up on that point. To the question about personal financial gain, there has been a lot of interesting reporting done on this. I will say Public Citizen is just now getting into doing some of this analysis ourselves. We tend to do more of the day-to-day advocacy, but they, Bill Hartung does a lot of good writing on this, writes it up both for his column in Forbes and is also with the Quincy Institute. So I would point you in the direction of some of his writing where he's really looked at both the profits that defense contractors are making and then also the ties to individual members of Congress. It's a little bit more laborious in terms of looking at each individual member's holdings, but you definitely find that the story tracks when you do that type of analysis, as well as Stephen Semler is another researcher in this broader coalition and field who does a lot of that. I will speak and say we have begun to investigate this, particularly along the lines of looking at why basically the House Armed Services Committee and Senate Armed Services Committee are so wedded to putting these larger, tens of billions of dollars increases on the Pentagon budget every year on top of the president's proposal. Last year, we didn't look into specific individual holdings of the members, but we did look into campaign contributions that were made by the military industrial complex as a whole, and looked at what was given to those members and then, comparatively how those members voted in favor of the plus up. And so we've been looking at kind of that connection, how the constant investment and lobbying and campaigns, support, not to even mention or go into individual stock holdings or things like that by members, but looking at how that reaps a massive benefit. The amount is to the tune of $20,000 of contributions, and then you get billions of dollars in plus ups. So it is a really lucrative turnaround, and we've looked into that a little bit. So I'll send that report here, and then just say there's more to be found, and certainly it's well within your right to be referencing those connections as you talk about kind of the way that the military industrial complex has Congress in a chokehold.
Yeah, thank you for that. We might have time for maybe one or two more. And I had a question, actually. You referenced things that are not subject to, that are exempt from this cut. Can you speak a little bit? I imagine as folks are going to these meetings, probably Ukraine will be a major point of conversation of offices pushing back and saying, now's not the time for this, given what's happening in the world. We know that Ukraine funding has typically been separate, but how would you message on that at this time?
I would just say really quickly exactly that, which is that this number we're talking about, the number that keeps being requested for the Pentagon, the amount that keeps getting added on top of that, absolutely none of that is about Ukraine. It's a wholly separate number. Ukraine funding has happened supplementally outside the regular budget process. For Public Citizen, we don't take a position on the merits of Ukraine funding. In fact, it literally has nothing to do with this number. It's a completely separate issue. So I would encourage offices not to conflate them as well. And I think it's actually really important that we make very clear for them we're not talking about Ukraine here. If people have things they want to say about Ukraine, great. But the base military budget is a totally separate question.
Great. Yeah.
So, sorry, the other thing I will say really quickly too, because offices might bring this up, is that through that supplemental funding, something that Congress has already allocated in each supplemental package are replenishment funds for what is being given to Ukraine, because that's another thing we hear, no, we've got to keep the Pentagon budget high because we have to replace everything that we've been giving to Ukraine. That's already included in the Ukraine funding as well. So that's double dipping if we want to increase the base budget on top of it.
Yeah, and I would just add one point to that, which is that another thing we think about and we message on a lot on this is, in addition to them being in supplementals, if we are at a real risk of Ukraine being an argument for plussing up the base budget, and we know historically that once some number or amount makes it into the base budget, it doesn't quite matter what it's in there for. That number is never coming down. And so I think also being conscious of the fact that once the base budget is increased by $30 billion in, maybe it has the specific targeted purpose, whatever it may be. But next year we're starting from that top line level, and they will find a place for that funding to go, if not, to the specific thing that we're talking about. So we, again, like Elizabeth has said, have been really, targeted and focused on the fact that it is funded through supplementals. We're not litigating, the merit of Ukraine crisis funding. In fact, that can be litigated very separately, but there is this real risk, as we saw with like the post 9/11 wars, of like the second that you add, a pool of funding to the base budget, that amount just goes up from there. And in the next year, even if it's not used for that particular purpose, it will then be, absorbed into something like procurement, absorbed into something like, contract or a new contract. So we just keep that in mind as well.
Awesome. And one, I think maybe this is the last, maybe closing comment, but I'll frame it also in a form of a question. One of the other questions came in about how is this work being done in intersectional ways, such as with the Poor People's Campaign or others. And I think maybe just as a closing comment from each of you, how do you see these struggles connected to the struggles for racial justice, for for other domestic needs, for things like what the Poor People's Campaign is pushing for? As people of faith, we do this holistically. And so if you could say a little bit about, kind of from a campaign perspective or also personally, how do you see kind of all this connected? And as an encouragement for our folks to add this to the list of things that they're doing.
Savannah, do you want to take it or me?
Either. I was like nodding along enthusiastically. I'm happy
okay. I can maybe start. Yeah, we work with the Poor People's Campaign all the time. They're really close partners. We're supportive of their efforts, and they're supportive of ours. They're very much one and the same. I think it's like President Eisenhower's speech said, every dollar that we spend on weapons and war and military manufacturing, it's a dollar we're not spending on people, and we're not spending on people's needs. And so these are interconnected struggles. And that is the point of the People Over Pentagon campaign, is to tie them together. That's why we're organizing cross-sectorally, because imagine what this world could look like if we did not spend on the military in this way. And that's how they're connected, is because we are making those choices. It affects every issue, every struggle. It's all interconnected. What we do with our money is the best indication of what our values are and what we think deserves resources. Like budgets decide who lives, who dies, who has healthcare, who doesn't. It's so fundamental to everything that we do. And so it's actually, it's really morally gross that we continue to just pour into corporate profiteering and warmongering and fear-mongering in this way. It directly starves people, and it directly takes away from the needs of people. So that's the connection I would make. That's the connection we work with the Poor People's Campaign to make. Savannah, I don't know if you have any more on that.
Yeah, really, it's quite on the nose. Like, my response will be very similar to yours, but I think I think back when I am asked something like this to how I started in this work, and I started on the opposite side of the invest, divest framework, where I was doing a lot of advocacy that was like, we need, this amount of money for this program, or, people in our community are asking for this thing. And it was a lot of like arguing for proactive investment in things. And I think as I was doing that work and realizing we were kind of scrabbling upstream to fund, have all of our community's needs funded, it became so apparent that like part of the reason that we were struggling with getting these programs funded and enacted was that we were allocating our resources in such a disproportionate way. And then, almost was radicalized by the idea of like looking across the other side of the budget and seeing what was happening on that side, and then realizing there was a role for us to play in attacking that hypocrisy, essentially, to reclaim that funding. And so I think I very much see, as we work with all kinds of different groups, Poor People's Campaign included, but a lot of the different groups in our coalition that have like very pinpointed focuses, right? Trying to get this particular package of, social spending through, or working on anti-poverty initiatives, or working on, racial justice programming and funding. There are often very specific demands and asks of like, our world would be brighter and we would take care of each other in a more brilliant way, like if we had these things. And I think the real compelling pitch to me is we could have more of those things were we to tackle the way that we're just allocating our national resources. So for me, it seems like a place where we can like hack away at a behemoth in order to kind of free up some of this funding, which obviously I know we're cautious of always saying like it's tit for tat. We definitely could spend more on social spending, even without this, right? We don't want to, fall into the same trap of tying them together. But it is true, nonetheless, that were we to free up billions of dollars, I just envision like shaking that loose for all the programming that would really be beneficial. So I think it's kind of those other sides of the coin.
All right, thank you. Oh, Carol, just to respond to your question in the chat, yes, we're asking for particularly members of the House to co-sponsor HR 1134, and then on the Senate side, which a lot of the meetings are on the Senate side, asking them to support pushing back against, speak out against almost $1 trillion going into the Pentagon, and eventually to consider co-sponsoring what would be a companion bill that has not yet been introduced. I put into the chat earlier, we created an EAD action alert that would go to both your House and Senate offices that is pushing for both aspects of the ask. Even if you're not meeting with your House member, you can still send them that letter. And finally, just to say, I appreciate lifting up Eisenhower again. To me, the operative word there is the theft that is happening out of the mouths of our children. And it's time for us to hold Congress accountable for that theft happening daily in our country. And so excited to continue working with both of you, Elizabeth and Savannah, in this work. And to all of you out there, thanks for joining, and courage in the struggle. Thanks for lifting up your voice here on the Hill today. Peace.